Hi, and welcome back to week 3. The reality of life is that it is tough being the underdog. I find a lot of inspiration from underdog stories, those who do what they do best, which is fight the odds. They push through the criticism. They drive through the obstacles when the deck is stacked against them. You know, the reality is that Saul has a reaction to David after he kills Goliath that honestly turns David into the underdog. Instead of rejoicing in the victory, he immediately reacts with a strange question to those around him. Who is this kid? You know, I'm sure we can all recall times in our lives when we thought to ourselves about the accomplishment of others, and we've speculated how easy it would have been for us to do the same thing. Perhaps we regret the things that we didn't do more than we feel the pain over the things we tried to do and failed. I want to caution you to beware of this kind of regret and jealousy. It leads to dark places. And a dark place is precisely where it took Saul. Imagine if social media had existed back then. Saul might have reacted with a viral meme or a picture of Saul on one side and David on the other. Underneath, the caption reads, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Perhaps you can imagine how Saul would have fumed watching the retweets and the shares and the likes stack up. Well, he wasn't looking at Instagram back then, but what happened could not have been worse for his ego. We read that Saul heard singing, tambourines, and other instruments playing as people sang and marched through the streets with these words, David has slain his 10,000s. As Saul sits harboring his anger, we read how harmful the spirit was that came upon him. David is in Saul's house playing a musical instrument. Saul takes a spear in his hand and he hurls it at David, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. David eludes him twice, and Saul grows more afraid of David. The reality is that David has the Spirit of the Lord, and the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul. 1 Samuel 18, 11 and 12 tells us this. And so Saul, perhaps wanting to seem something different than what he really is, tries to come across as grateful and benevolent to the people. He offers his oldest daughter to David for a wife, while all the time he's thinking, I'll not raise a hand against him. I'm going to let the Philistines do that. David is told that all Saul wants for his daughter's hand is for David to kill 100 Philistines and return with their foreskins. Now, I can only speculate about why Saul dreams up such a task for his future son-in-law. Perhaps Saul thinks the task is too dangerous and hopes David will die trying to fulfill the qualification. Maybe he thinks David will back out and not be willing to do it. But eventually we read that Saul told his son Jonathan and all of the attendants to kill David, even if he succeeded. The reality is that we have an enemy, and our enemy has sadistic tendencies and desires as well. The determination that Saul displays as he attempts to end David's life should remind us of how the real enemy works against us today as believers. The Apostle Peter writes to the church and he says, be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to destroy. The body of Christ, the church, has a Saul, an enemy seeking our destruction. And we don't need to be surprised when people that we trust come at us to destroy us. The reality is that the path out of the conflict is different than what the world says. You see, Paul takes matters into his own hands, and his actions and orders result in a horrifying tragedy that affects many for generations to come. David, on the other hand, chooses wisely and handles the conflict by following the heart of God, his Father. Saul says, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And he weeps aloud when he realizes that David has once again surpassed him, this time in righteousness. Once again, David trusts God with the conflict. He doesn't go his own way. He doesn't go the world's way, or the way that others try to influence him to go. He chooses God's way. When we see that David learns that in conflict and how to handle it, we can see a lesson that we would be well to learn. You see, David doesn't ignore the situation or pretend that it doesn't exist. In fact, he acknowledges the person who is coming after him. David doesn't confront Saul immediately because confrontation is not always the best course of action, especially when someone is so angry with us that they can't even be reasoned with. I realize to some it might seem that David did confront him immediately, yet I ask you to consider this possibility. David is a warrior king. He is used to making split-second decisions, to reacting in the moment. But what I see here as a person who has tendencies similar to these is that the exercise of restraint and thought, which in my mind requires patience, is what David displays. If we look at the perspective, I believe we will see that patience produced a maturing of the fruit of the Spirit, which is love. David exhibited a tremendous capacity to forgive. Among humans, forgiveness of this magnitude is rare. And we have to remember that in Romans 5:8 we read that God demonstrates His own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You know, the reality is that when we forgive, we pursue the heart of God. As you go into your groups today, I want you to think about what it means to truly forgive. To look at forgiveness and look at this relationship between Saul and David and see how we might deal with others.